The concentration camp at Bolzano, known in German as Bozen, was one of the last concentration camps established by Nazi Germany during the Second World War. Located in the city of Bolzano in northern Italy, the camp operated from the summer of 1944 until the final months of the war in 1945. Unlike the more widely known extermination camps in Eastern Europe, Bolzano was primarily a transit and forced labor camp, yet it formed a crucial link in the Nazi system of repression, deportation, and exploitation. Its history reflects the expansion of Nazi terror into Italy after the collapse of the Italian fascist regime, and reveals how occupation, collaboration, and violence reshaped the region in the final phase of the war. Before the war, Bolzano was a multilingual city in South Tyrol, a region annexed by Italy after the First World War. The population included German-speaking, Italian-speaking, and Ladin communities, shaped by shifting borders and competing national identities. Under fascist rule, the Italian government attempted to suppress German language and culture, fueling long-standing tensions. These divisions became even more pronounced after September 1943, when Italy signed an armistice with the Allies and effectively withdrew from the Axis alliance. Following the armistice, Nazi Germany moved swiftly to occupy northern and central Italy. The country was divided, with the south under Allied control and the north placed under German military occupation. The region of South Tyrol, including Bolzano, was incorporated into the operational zone of the Alpine foothills, directly administered by Nazi authorities rather than the Italian Social Republic. This meant that German law, German police forces, and German racial policies were enforced with little interference. As German control tightened, repression intensified. Jews, political opponents, resistance fighters, deserters, and civilians suspected of aiding the Allies became targets of arrest. The Nazi security apparatus, including the SS and Gestapo, sought facilities to detain, interrogate, and deport prisoners. Existing prisons quickly became overcrowded. In this context, the Bolzano concentration camp was established in the summer of 1944. The camp was constructed on the site of a former military warehouse area near the Bolzano railway station. Its location was strategically chosen. The proximity to rail lines made it ideal for transporting prisoners northward into the Reich, particularly to camps such as Dachau, Mauthausen, and Flossenbürg. Bolzano thus functioned as a key transit hub in the deportation network connecting Italy to the broader Nazi camp system. Officially designated as a polizeiliches Durchgangslager, or police transit camp, Bolzano was nonetheless run according to the principles of the concentration camp system. It was placed under SS control, with commandants and guards drawn from German units and local collaborators. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, and prisoners were subjected to strict discipline, forced labor, and brutal punishment. From its earliest days, the prisoner population at Bolzano was diverse. Italian political prisoners formed a large portion of the inmates, including members of resistance groups, anti-fascists, and individuals accused of sabotage. Jews arrested in northern Italy were also held at Bolzano before deportation to extermination camps. In addition, the camp held foreign nationals, forced laborers, and civilians detained during security sweeps. Women and men were imprisoned in separate sections, though conditions were harsh for all. Life inside the camp was characterized by overcrowding, hunger, and constant fear. Barracks were poorly constructed and inadequately heated, leaving prisoners exposed to extreme cold during the winter months. Food rations were minimal, often consisting of thin soup and small quantities of bread. Malnutrition weakened inmates and made them more vulnerable to disease. Medical care was scarce and often denied altogether. Forced labor was a central feature of daily life at Bolzano. Prisoners were assigned to work details both inside and outside the camp. Some were sent to nearby factories, workshops, and construction sites, where they labored under guard for long hours. Others were forced to perform maintenance work within the camp itself. Refusal or inability to work was met with beatings, confinement, or worse. The SS guards exercised near-total authority over prisoners. Punishments were arbitrary and often sadistic. Beatings, prolonged standing at attention, and confinement in punishment cells were common. Interrogations conducted by the Gestapo frequently involved torture, particularly for political prisoners suspected of resistance activities. Executions, though not routine, did occur, serving as a warning to others. One of the most significant roles of the Bolzano camp was its function as a deportation centre. Prisoners were periodically assembled and transported north in sealed railcars. For many, Bolzano was the last place they saw Italy. Jews deported from the camp were typically sent to Auschwitz, where most were murdered upon arrival. Political prisoners were often sent to Dachau or Mauthausen, camps notorious for brutal labour conditions and high mortality rates. The camp administration kept records of prisoners, though many documents were destroyed as the war drew to a close. Despite this, historians estimate that several thousand people passed through Bolzano during its operation. Hundreds did not survive imprisonment, deportation, or subsequent incarceration in other camps. Relations between German authorities and local collaborators played a key role in the camp's operation. Members of the Italian Social Republic assisted in arrests and intelligence gathering, while German forces maintained ultimate control. This collaboration complicates post-war memory, as responsibility for crimes was shared across national lines. Outside the camp, the civilian population of Bolzano lived under occupation, subject to air raids, food shortages, and reprisals. Some residents attempted to assist prisoners by smuggling food or information, while others avoided involvement out of fear. Acts of resistance existed but carried severe consequences. The presence of the camp was known, yet its full reality remained hidden behind walls and barbed wire. As the war entered its final phase in early 1945, conditions in the camp worsened. Allied advances and intensified partisan activity increased German anxiety. Deportations continued, though transportation networks were increasingly disrupted by bombing. Prisoners sensed that the end of the war was approaching, but uncertainty and fear dominated daily life. In April 1945, as German forces retreated, the SS began evacuating prisoners from Bolzano. Some were forced on marches northward under brutal conditions. Others were left behind as the camp administration collapsed. When Allied forces reached Bolzano, they found survivors suffering from exhaustion, illness, and trauma, along with evidence of systematic abuse. The liberation of the camp marked the end of its operation, but not the end of its legacy. Survivors faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives amid physical and psychological scars. Families searched for missing relatives, often discovering that they had been deported and killed elsewhere. The camp itself became a symbol of Nazi occupation in Italy, though its history remained less known than that of camps beyond the Alps. In the immediate post-war years, efforts to prosecute those responsible met with mixed results. Some camp officials were tried and convicted, while others evaded justice or received light sentences. Political tensions of the early Cold War, combined with the complexity of collaboration and occupation, limited the scope of accountability. For decades, the memory of Bolzano concentration camp was overshadowed by larger and more infamous sites of Nazi terror. Yet its significance lies precisely in its location and function. It demonstrates that the concentration camp system extended deep into Italy, adapting to local conditions while maintaining its core purpose of repression and exploitation. The camp at Bolzano reveals how rapidly Nazi policies could be imposed on occupied territories and how ordinary urban spaces could be transformed into instruments of terror. It also highlights the interconnected nature of the camp system, in which transit camps played a crucial role in sustaining mass deportation and murder. This concludes Part 1, covering the historical background, establishment, daily life, and function of the Bolzano concentration camp within the Nazi system. Part 2 will examine deportations in greater detail, prisoner testimonies, resistance, liberation, post-war trials, and the camp's place in historical memory. Deportations from the Bolzano concentration camp followed a grim and methodical pattern that reflected the broader functioning of the Nazi camp system. Prisoners were typically held for weeks or months while awaiting transport, uncertain of their fate and often unaware of their destination. Deportation lists were prepared by camp authorities, sometimes based on perceived political threat, racial classification, or simple administrative convenience. Once selected, prisoners were assembled under guard, searched, and marched to the nearby railway station, where cattle cars or sealed freight wagons awaited them. The conditions during transport were brutal. Prisoners were packed tightly into rail cars with little ventilation, no sanitation, and minimal food or water. Journeys lasted several days, during which illness and death were common. For Jewish prisoners deported from Bolzano to Auschwitz, arrival often meant immediate selection and murder in gas chambers. Political prisoners and resistance members sent to Dachau, Mauthausen, or Flossenbürg faced forced labor under conditions that resulted in high mortality rates. In this way, Bolzano served not merely as a holding site, but as an integral node in the machinery of genocide and repression. Survivor testimonies provide crucial insight into daily life and survival strategies within the camp. Former prisoners described a constant struggle to preserve dignity and humanity under dehumanizing conditions. Solidarity among inmates, though difficult to sustain, played a vital role in survival. Prisoners shared food, warned one another of impending inspections, and attempted to protect the weakest among them. These acts, while small, represented resistance to a system designed to isolate and break individuals. Women imprisoned at Bolzano faced additional hardships. They were often subjected to harassment, abuse, and humiliation by guards. Mothers were separated from children, and pregnant women received no special care. Female prisoners were assigned to labor details that included factory work, cleaning, and carrying heavy loads, despite malnutrition and exhaustion. Their experiences highlight the gendered dimensions of suffering within the camp system. The presence of political prisoners from various ideological backgrounds shaped the internal dynamics of the camp. Communists, socialists, Catholic activists, and members of partisan groups brought with them organizational experience that sometimes facilitated mutual support networks. However, these same prisoners were often singled out for harsh treatment by the Gestapo, who viewed them as particularly dangerous. Interrogations aimed at extracting information about resistance networks were frequently violent, leaving many prisoners physically and psychologically scarred. Resistance connected to the Bolzano camp took multiple forms, both inside and outside the wire. Within the camp, resistance was necessarily limited and covert. Prisoners attempted to sabotage work assignments, falsify information during interrogations, or conceal the identities of fellow inmates. Outside the camp, partisan groups sought to disrupt German operations and occasionally attempted to assist prisoners through smuggling food, medicine, or messages. Such efforts were dangerous and often met with reprisals, but they underscored the broader struggle against occupation. The German occupation authorities relied heavily on collaboration to maintain control. Italian fascist police units assisted in arrests, surveillance, and intelligence gathering. This collaboration facilitated the identification of Jews, resistance members, and political opponents, many of whom ended up in Bolzano. The involvement of local collaborators complicates post-war narratives of victimhood and resistance, revealing a spectrum of behavior shaped by fear, ideology, and self-interest. As Allied forces advanced northward in 1945, the atmosphere within the camp grew increasingly tense. Guards became more unpredictable, oscillating between neglect and brutality. Supplies dwindled, and food rations were further reduced. Deportations continued even as transportation networks collapsed, reflecting the regime's determination to maintain control and eliminate perceived enemies until the very end. In April 1945, with German defeat imminent, the SS began evacuating prisoners from Bolzano. Some transports were sent north toward Austria and Germany, while others were forced on foot in chaotic and violent marches. Prisoners who could not keep up were often shot or abandoned. These evacuations mirrored the death marches occurring across the collapsing Nazi camp system. When Allied forces entered Bolzano at the beginning of May 1945, they found a camp in disarray. Some prisoners had already been deported or killed, while others remained behind, weakened by starvation and illness. Liberation brought relief, but also confusion and grief. Survivors faced the immediate challenge of medical recovery and the longer process of rebuilding lives shattered by imprisonment and loss. The aftermath of liberation exposed the difficulty of achieving justice. While some camp officials and guards were identified and prosecuted, many evaded accountability. Trials were often limited in scope, hampered by destroyed evidence, political priorities, and the onset of the Cold War. In some cases, sentences were reduced or overturned, deepening survivors' sense of injustice. In post-war Italy, the memory of Nazi occupation and collaboration became politically sensitive. The narrative of national resistance often overshadowed discussions of complicity and collaboration. As a result, the history of Bolzano concentration camp remained relatively marginal in public discourse for many years. Survivors' voices struggled to gain recognition in a society eager to move forward. Over time, historians began to reassess the significance of camps like Bolzano. Research highlighted their role in sustaining the Nazi camp system beyond Germany's borders and demonstrated how occupation policies were enforced through terror and deportation. Bolzano emerged as a key example of how the concentration camp system adapted to local conditions while maintaining its essential functions. The physical site of the camp underwent transformation after the war. Parts of the former camp area were repurposed for civilian use, while others fell into neglect. This physical erasure mirrored the broader challenge of preserving memory. Without visible remnants, the risk of forgetting increased. Efforts by survivors, historians, and local organizations eventually led to the creation of memorials and educational initiatives aimed at preserving the camp's history. Today, the Bolzano concentration camp is recognized as a symbol of Nazi repression in Italy. It stands as evidence that the Holocaust and the system of concentration camps were not confined to distant locations, but were present in Italian cities and communities. The camp's history challenges simplified narratives of occupation and resistance, revealing a complex reality shaped by fear, collaboration, and moral choice. The story of Bolzano also underscores the importance of transit camps within the Nazi system. While extermination camps carried out mass murder, transit camps like Bolzano ensured the flow of victims into that system. Without them, deportations on such a scale would not have been possible. Their role, though less visible, was essential to the functioning of genocide and repression. In examining Bolzano, it becomes clear that concentration camps served multiple purposes simultaneously. They were instruments of punishment, sources of forced labor, centers of terror, and logistical hubs. This multifunctional nature allowed the system to permeate occupied societies and integrate itself into existing administrative and economic structures. The legacy of Bolzano concentration camp is ultimately one of warning. It demonstrates how quickly legal norms can collapse under authoritarian rule and how ordinary spaces can be transformed into sites of extreme violence. The camp's existence depended not only on ideological fanaticism, but also on bureaucratic efficiency, local cooperation, and widespread silence. Remembering Bolzano means acknowledging the victims who passed through its gates and those who never returned. It also means confronting uncomfortable questions about responsibility, collaboration, and the fragility of human rights. The camp's history reminds us that mass violence is rarely the result of a single decision, but of countless actions taken by individuals within a system that rewards obedience and punishes dissent. As part of the broader history of the Holocaust and Nazi occupation, the Bolzano concentration camp occupies a crucial place. It connects Italy to the wider network of camps that spanned Europe and illustrates how the machinery of terror extended across borders. Its story adds depth and complexity to our understanding of the Second World War and the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. In preserving and studying the history of Bolzano, we honor those who suffered and reaffirm the importance of historical memory. The camp's legacy serves as a reminder that vigilance, education, and moral responsibility are essential safeguards against the repetition of such crimes. Through remembrance, the voices of the victims continue to speak, urging future generations to confront the past honestly and to recognize the warning signs of oppression wherever they appear. To understand the significance of the Bolzano concentration camp within the Nazi system, it is necessary to place it within the broader context of German occupation policy in Italy after 1943. Unlike Eastern Europe, where Nazi racial policy had already been implemented over several years, Italy represented a newly occupied territory where repression had to be imposed rapidly. The establishment of camps such as Bolzano reflected the urgency with which German authorities sought to neutralize opposition, control the population, and maintain logistical routes to the Reich. Bolzano was not an improvised solution, but a calculated response to the growing resistance and instability in northern Italy. The camp's administrative structure followed established SS models. Command authority rested with German officers, while day-to-day operations relied on a mix of German personnel and auxiliary forces. This included guards, clerks, and interrogators who maintained records, organized labor detachments, and prepared deportation transports. The bureaucratic nature of the camp was central to its function. Prisoners were reduced to numbers, categorized by perceived threat or usefulness, and processed accordingly. This bureaucratic efficiency masked the violence at the heart of the system, allowing atrocities to be carried out as routine administrative acts. Interrogation played a central role at Bolzano, particularly for political prisoners and resistance members. The camp functioned as a place where information was extracted through intimidation and torture. Prisoners suspected of involvement with partisan groups were isolated, beaten, and threatened with deportation or execution. These interrogations were often conducted by the Gestapo, whose presence reinforced the camp's role as an instrument of political repression. Information obtained at Bolzano contributed to wider crackdowns on resistance networks across northern Italy. The camp's role as a forced labor reservoir was also significant. Prisoners were dispatched daily to labor sites under armed guard. Some worked in nearby industrial facilities producing goods for the German war effort, while others were assigned to infrastructure projects, including road repair and debris clearing following Allied air raids. Labor conditions were harsh, with long hours, inadequate nutrition, and constant surveillance. Injuries were common, and prisoners who could no longer work were punished rather than treated. Jewish prisoners held at Bolzano experienced a particularly precarious existence. While the camp was not an extermination site, its function as a transit point placed Jewish inmates in constant danger of deportation to Auschwitz. Arrests of Jews intensified after German occupation, aided by fascist police and informants. Families were torn apart, and many Jews passed through Bolzano only briefly before being transported north. For these prisoners, the camp represented a final threshold between life in Italy and near certain death elsewhere. Children were also among the prisoners held at Bolzano, either detained with family members or arrested independently. Their presence highlights the indiscriminate nature of Nazi repression in the final stages of the war. Children suffered from hunger, cold, and disease, and were often witnesses to violence that left lasting psychological scars. Their experiences complicate any attempt to view the camp purely through the lens of military necessity or security. Despite extreme conditions, prisoners developed coping mechanisms that allowed some to survive. Routine, however brutal, provided a sense of predictability. Small acts such as sharing food, exchanging information, or preserving personal rituals helped maintain a sense of identity. In some cases, prisoners with specialized skills, such as mechanics or clerks, were able to secure slightly better conditions, though this often came at the cost of moral compromise or resentment from fellow inmates. The relationship between prisoners and guards varied, though it was overwhelmingly characterized by brutality. Some guards exploited their power through arbitrary punishment, while others maintained emotional distance, treating prisoners as objects rather than people. Rare instances of limited compassion did occur, but they did not alter the fundamental nature of the camp. The system was designed to function regardless of individual behavior, ensuring that suffering remained constant. As the war progressed, Allied bombing increasingly affected Bolzano and the surrounding region. Air raids targeted railways and industrial sites, disrupting deportations and supply lines. Prisoners were often forced to work in dangerous conditions during and after bombings, clearing rubble or repairing infrastructure. These raids intensified fear among both prisoners and guards, contributing to the growing sense of chaos that marked the final months of the camp's operation. The collapse of German authority in Italy was gradual rather than sudden. Even as defeat became inevitable, the camp continued to operate according to established routines. Deportations, forced labor, and punishment persisted. This persistence reflects the ideological rigidity of the Nazi system, which prioritized control and repression even when strategic logic had collapsed. Liberation did not arrive as a dramatic single moment for all prisoners. Some were freed by Allied troops, others by local resistance forces, and still others escaped during evacuations. For many survivors, liberation was accompanied by physical collapse. Years of malnutrition, illness, and stress left lasting damage. Medical assistance was often improvised, and recovery took months or years. In the immediate post-war period, survivors of Bolzano faced enormous challenges. Many had no homes to return to, their families having been deported or killed. Jewish survivors often discovered that entire communities had been destroyed. Political prisoners returned to a country grappling with the aftermath of occupation, civil conflict, and economic devastation. Recognition of their suffering was uneven, shaped by political priorities and competing narratives of victimhood. Judicial efforts to address crimes committed at Bolzano were limited. Some perpetrators were identified and tried, but many escaped accountability. Documentation had been destroyed, witnesses dispersed, and political will weakened by the onset of Cold War tensions. The complexity of German occupation and Italian collaboration further complicated prosecutions. As a result, many survivors felt that justice was incomplete or absent altogether. The memory of Bolzano concentration camp evolved slowly. In the decades following the war, public attention focused largely on resistance heroism and national reconstruction. Camps located outside Italy received greater recognition, reinforcing the misconception that the Holocaust occurred elsewhere. Bolzano's history remained known primarily to survivors and specialists, preserved through testimony rather than public commemoration. Gradually, historical research began to integrate Bolzano into broader studies of Nazi repression in Italy. Scholars emphasized the camp's role as a transit hub and highlighted its importance in understanding the mechanics of occupation. Survivor testimonies were collected, archived, and published, ensuring that individual experiences were not lost. These efforts contributed to a more nuanced understanding of the Italian wartime experience. Memorialization efforts eventually led to the establishment of commemorative sites and educational programs at the former camp location. These initiatives sought to preserve memory while addressing the challenges posed by urban development and the absence of intact camp structures. Memorials served not only as places of remembrance, but also as tools for education, emphasizing the dangers of authoritarianism and the erosion of civil liberties. Bolzano concentration camp occupies a unique position in Holocaust history. It was neither an extermination camp nor a purely local detention center. Instead, it functioned as a connective tissue linking Italian repression to the wider system of camps across Europe. Its existence underscores the transnational nature of Nazi crimes and the extent to which occupation policies relied on standardized methods of control. The camp's history also illustrates how quickly social norms can collapse under pressure. Ordinary citizens became guards, informants, or bureaucrats, while others chose resistance or silence. These choices were shaped by fear, ideology, and circumstance, but they collectively enabled the system to function. Bolzano reminds us that mass violence depends not only on leaders but on the participation or acquiescence of many. In examining Bolzano, it becomes clear that concentration camps served as instruments of both terror and organization. They imposed discipline through fear while structuring labor, deportation, and repression in a systematic way. This dual function made them adaptable and effective tools of occupation, capable of integrating into diverse local contexts. The legacy of Bolzano concentration camp continues to resonate today. It challenges narratives that isolate the Holocaust geographically or morally. It demonstrates that the machinery of Nazi terror extended into Italy, involving local institutions and individuals. Remembering Bolzano means acknowledging this complexity and confronting uncomfortable truths about responsibility and complicity. Ultimately, the history of the Bolzano camp is a history of human beings subjected to extreme conditions by a system that prioritized ideology and control over life. It is a story of suffering, resilience, and moral ambiguity. Preserving this history ensures that the victims are not reduced to statistics and that the lessons of the past remain visible. The camp's existence serves as a reminder that the final phase of the Second World War was marked not only by military collapse, but by intensified repression. Even as defeat loomed, the Nazi system continued to operate camps, deport prisoners, and enforce obedience. Bolzano stands as evidence of this grim persistence. By studying Bolzano concentration camp, we gain a deeper understanding of how authoritarian systems sustain themselves and how violence becomes normalized through bureaucracy and routine. The camp's history warns against complacency and underscores the importance of vigilance in defending human rights. The memory of Bolzano is not only about the past, it is about the present and future, about recognizing early signs of repression and understanding how easily legal protections can be dismantled. Through remembrance and education, the story of Bolzano continues to speak across generations. The concentration camp at Bolzano reminds us that the machinery of Nazi terror did not exist only in distant places, but operated within ordinary cities, alongside everyday life. It shows how repression spreads through bureaucracy, collaboration, and silence, and how quickly human rights can disappear when fear replaces responsibility. Remembering Bolzano is not only about honoring the victims who passed through its gates and those who never returned. It is about recognizing the warning signs of oppression before they become normalized. History is not buried in the past. It lives in the choices people make, then and now. Thank you for watching History in the Trenches. If you value careful, honest history, consider subscribing and continue exploring the past with us.